Hello folks, Scott here with the new My Monthly Hero October 2022 kit. Of course, everything comes in these 8x10 zipper top pouches. And this month we are headed right into a Christmas time. We've got a 6x8 inch clear stamp set that is holiday, holiday, holiday. We've got a Santa and his reindeer, stars, a spray of stars. Looks like a little Christmas village here. There's another little house down here. Only 4 sentiments. We've got 'Tis the Season, Merry Christmas, Sending Holiday Cheer, Happy Holidays. Lots of little silhouette images. Looks like that's Santa and a reindeer. Lots of elves, or a number of elves. We've got a nice little pine tree border here, it looks like. And of course, a Christmas tree, a smaller tree, a North Pole sign. I love this little train over here that actually has a train track underneath it as well. This is in perspective, a train track to put your train on. Very cute. Of course, we have frame cuts for all of those images. We've got 19 coordinating frame cuts. This is the train, the sign. So this is to cut out the pine border. This cuts out the big village. Of course, we've also got one for the small house. And it wasn't until I was cutting apart the dies that I realized that we have dies for our sentiments. All 4 of our sentiments have dies. We get a cling stamp also. We get the Snow Dots cling stamp. I'm not sure what I think about this. It seems extremely stripy to me. I'm not sure. We'll have to play with that. This is a little over 4.5 inches, a little over 5 3/4 of an inch. So it's large enough to do an A2 card. Snow Dots cling stamp. Very interesting. We get 2 ink cubes this month. We've got the Hero Hues Reactive Sea Salt and the Hero Hues Unicorn. I love Unicorn ink from Hero Arts. It is, I think, one of the best white inks on the market. Love that. The Reactive Sea Salt is great for effects because it's reactive, whereas the Unicorn ink is a pigment ink, so that's a permanent ink. It's our 2 white inks. We also get some paper this month. We get 2 sheets of diamond glitter paper. Look at that. I think that's really fascinating. It kind of looks like little miniature honeycombs. Very, very sparkly. It's, of course, 5.5 by 8.5. Then we have 2 sheets of Snow Glow cardstock, which are kind of like a shimmer cardstock, a really nice soft shimmer. It's got the same on both sides, 2 sheets of those, and then 2 sheets of lapis, L-A-P-I-S, lapis cardstock. Nice medium blue. That's everything. I also wanted to show, of course, the back of our backer card has this very interesting trifold card where the front folds down and the inside folds open. Very interesting. Maybe we'll try to make one of those. Maybe we'll expand beyond that as well. So Merry Christmas, October 2022, My Monthly Hero Kit. Let's start playing. And here we go. Here I have my 10 cards. Looks like everything is on a white card base. I might have a surprise or 2 in here for you. Now, since there are only 4 sentiments in this stamp set, I decided to poach some extra holiday sentiments from past My Monthly Hero Christmas kits. So we've got October of 2019, November of 2019, November of 2020, and October of 21. So I pulled a number of sentiments from these past My Monthly Hero Christmas sets. And this inspired my own little trifold adventure. So for our first card, we've got, this is more of a traditional side-to-side trifold card. We start on the side of this big mountain with a train rounding the bend and the village in the background, all under the watchful eye of a reindeer. We flip open that right panel, and the whole village is revealed with railroad tracks and someone waiting on the hillside. One more flip to the left, and we have our final scene. Looks like somebody finally made it home. Also, the moon has risen higher, so it seems that it took a little while for that train to come in. And of course, there's no place like home for the holidays. There's no place like home for the holidays. I love it when a trifold card tells a story. And I tell you, the stamps in this kit are perfectly suited for that. So all the stamping on this card is done on Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. So I generally make my trifold cards with 2 card bases and just glue the backs of 2 of them together to make a trifold card. So that's how I started. My first bit is stamped on the back of an A2 card base. I curved the train and the track to suggest a mountain curve. I stamped those and the reindeer with intense black ink. I fussy cut the mountain and a little bit on the front of the engine, just that tiny little bit there, not hard at all. I blended blue reactive ink on the edges of the mountain and a couple little contours for the deer and the top of the mountain there. Of course, we see the village and the sky and the moon in the background. I think that simple curve on the train gives a good suggestion of it going around the mountain. The second layer started on a full A2 card base. I stamped the village and the train tracks in intense black ink, and I did a partial die cut on the village, leaving the bottom of the card base intact. A little blending at the bottom of the village and on the tracks grounds them in the snow. I stamped our little fellow on another panel and used the die to partially cut him and finish the cut, putting him on a snow-covered hill. More of that blue reactive ink blending on the edges of the hill, and I glued that panel flat down onto this layer. Now, I wanted to use the lapis cardstock for the sky, so I quickly realized that I didn't need the entire back half of the second layer, so I trimmed that off, leaving just a small flap on the side to glue to the back of the first layer's base. Then I can add the sky and another die-cut hillside to the center layer, effectively covering up the flap on this side of our card. So I ink blended blue reactive ink and some black soot distress oxide ink in the sky and spattered some stars using some of my white gouache, my whole bean white gouache. Just spattered that lightly in the sky. This, of course, is on the lapis cardstock from the kit. I glued the sky to the back of the card, covering up that flap over here. For the final scene, I stamped the house and the couple in intense black ink, did a partial die cut on the house, and fussy cut the rest of the hill around that. I ink blended the edges and a little snowy contour here with blue reactive ink. This sentiment is from the November 2019 kit. There's no place like home for the holidays. This sentiment, and of course our little trifold prompt on our backer card, really are what inspired this card from me. I love this card, and I love how the story unfolds. Pun intended. So, of course, silhouette stamps lend themselves to shaker cards as well. Now, should we make a snow globe or a Christmas ornament this month? Well, since I don't have a specific snow globe die, we have our Christmas ornament here. Nice fun shaker card. I don't have a specific ornament die either, especially not this size. So I used a 3.5 inch and a 3 1/4 inch Hero Arts Infinity nesting circle dies to make a perfect ornament. I die cut some of the lapis cardstock with the 3.5 inch die, stamped Santa in soft granite ink, the moon with unicorn white ink, and the spray of stars I stamped with embossing and watermark ink, and then embossed those with some, this was from an old kit, Wow Cloud 9 embossing powder. Lots of sparkle on that. You can see that sparkle on that spray of stars even behind the acetate. And then I also used a white gel pen to draw some stars in the sky. So then I taped those 2 circle dies together, the 3 1/4 and 3.5, as evenly as possible, and I die cut the lapis frame and then 4 more frames from thick white cardstock. I glued the 4 frames together and see them right there on the edge, and then down to the background. I filled the interior with little micro beads. I love how they roll around in there, really kind of snow-like. And after I poured in the beads, I added a 3.5-inch piece of acetate and glued the lapis frame on the top of that. I fussy cut just a little piece of silver holographic cardstock to stand in for an ornament topper and tied a little double bow on the top. This is an old piece of pattern paper cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. This sentiment is from the November 2020 kit, Ho Ho Ho. I stamped that with soft granite ink also, and I glued that down to a white A2 card base. Now, I contemplated making this a removable ornament, but my ornament topper doesn't have a ring on it, so I decided to just go ahead and glue this down to the card base. I think this simple sentiment adds a lot to this whole card. Ho, 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 Santa flying through the sky with little sparkly snow all around him. Now, I really like this North Pole stamp here, but the sign felt a little short. I wanted to make the sign a little bit bigger, especially considering how large the sign itself is. So for card number 3, we've got sending an abundance of joy. Now this feels a little bit better as far as the perspective of this sign goes. Now this is all done with partial die cutting on Neenah 80-pound cardstock, just like the Trifold card, but with all the layers glued flat. The background is ink blended with some splash reactive ink and then some sea salt reactive ink. I ink blended that coming down from the top. That gave us a nice little darker edge at the snow line, a little lighter at the top. I stamped the cling stamp. Instead of vertically, I stamped it sideways on the back. I think that kind of helps get rid of what feels like a lot of straight lines to me. I stamped that in unicorn white ink and embossed it with some white embossing powder. The house layer is stamped with soft sky ink with a partial die cut and a fussy cut hillside. The sleigh layer is stamped with reactive early dawn ink with a little of that ink blended on the edges of the hillside. Again, just partial die cutting around the sleigh, finished out that cut by hand. Santa's layer is stamped and ink blended with splash reactive ink. Now, I did cut one more corner of snow here for the North Pole sign to live in. That's, of course, ink blended with more of that splash ink. Now, since I wanted to extend that pole, I stamped the sign using Tombow markers direct to the stamp. I used a couple of browns, and that gave me a nice mottled wood tone on the sign. And I left the sign detail itself to be finished with a stamping of caramel core ink. So I just didn't spend much time worrying about that, and then finally just took a small ink cube of that caramel ink just for the sign itself, so we got some good detail on the North Pole there. I extended that pole down longer using the same brown Tombow markers that I used to stamp the pole, and I partially die cut the sign without cutting the bottom, and then lengthened it, finished out the cut by hand. I do admit to taking my craft knife and fussy cutting the scroll work detail around the sign. Yes, I can be a little anal retentive that way, but I think this card was focused totally on the sign, so I thought it deserved it. Everything's glued flat to an A2 card base. There's a little bit of foam tape behind the top half of the sign. Now, I admit, when I first saw this deer stamp, I thought the footprints were poop. I admit it. And I realized that my partial die cutting on this, as opposed to the partial die cutting on the Trifold card, now here our little boy's footprints are deep in the snow. The hillside goes up beyond that. Even over here, their footprints are in the snow. The deer's footprints are in the snow. When I partially die cut these, I wasn't thinking of that. And so the deer footprints are kind of on top of the snow. And even Santa's footprints are on top of the snow over here as far as where I cut that layer. So I think they do look a little bit more like poop on this than footprints. If you do partial die cutting on these animals and people with footprints, Make sure that those footprints are placed well in the snow and not necessarily on top of the snow, sending an abundance of joy. So this large pine branch stamp caught my eye, and the curve of the branches suggested an oval to me. So our next card here, we have joy and peace to you and yours. This is my little Currier and Ives Christmas card. On a piece of Canson mixed media cardstock, I lightly ink blended soft sky ink over the entire panel, and I did a light spattering of the same ink. I picked an oval infinity nesting die that was 3 3/8 inches wide on the narrow side, and I cut my card panel to 3.5 inches wide. I stamped the pine branches using pine core ink on the 2 edges of the panel and centered those branches in the oval die for die cutting. The branches follow that oval quite nicely. I did ink blend a little antique linen distress oxide ink around the edges of the oval for a finishing touch. I thought I'd try a little no-line coloring, so I stamped the house using contour ink and colored it all using my Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers. I felt the need to have a super fine point on whatever medium I was using for coloring this tiny image. It was really easy to color right over the candy canes that are in that stamp. I really like that. That doesn't have to be Santa's house. And I did use my white Holbein gouache and some white gel pen to keep the snow nice and white and bright. Oh, this is far from perfect, but I think it does have a nice hand-painted feel. This sentiment is from the My Monthly Hero November 2020 kit, Joy and Peace to You and Yours. I stamped that with root beer reactive ink and embossed that with some clear embossing powder. I cut another piece of that old pattern paper. It was still sitting on my desk to 4 inches by 5 1/4. I glued that to an A2 white card base. I picked the next size larger infinity oval die, and I die cut a piece of auburn pearl cardstock, and then 3 more blanks from white scraps. So those are all glued together with my painted oval glued down on top. Those pine branches look much more detailed if you can avoid over-stamping them. I did match my sentiment up with my house stamp before I did their placement on this. I knew I was going to use this sentiment just to make sure everything fit, and I'm really thrilled at the nostalgic feel of this card. Not bad for a little silhouette stamp. So we also have the large and small tree, Christmas tree in our stamp set. I thought those would be the perfect partners for a more of a graphic layout. We've got From Our Family to Yours with all of those trees. Lots of sparkle on this card too. I stamped the large tree, masking off the star twice using pine ink and lime green ink. Now that gives a subtle variation in the greenery that isn't particularly noticeable, but it actually adds a lot to that solid tree stamp. Then I masked off the tree and I stamped the star with embossing ink and embossed that with some gold embossing powder. I die cut the tree and 2 blanks and glued them all together. I cut a panel of white cardstock to 2.5 inches by 5.5 inches, and I stamped the smaller trees in a line across the center. I knew the big tree was going in the center, so I stamped the trees from the right to the center and from the left to the center, not worrying about if my spacing was perfect between the center 2 trees. That's forever green on the edges, then forest, then pine, and then lime green in the center. This sentiment is from the My Monthly Hero October 19 kit, From Our Family to Yours. I stamped that on the panel with some embossing and watermark ink and embossed that with the same gold as the star. I cut a piece of old pattern papers, another piece of old Christmassy pattern paper, to 3 inches by 5.5. I glued that to the center of a white card base, and I glued the tree panel on top. I glued the big Christmas tree in the center and adorned all of the ornament openings, with Pink Fresh Studio gold metallic pearls. I also have these crystal tree gems in my stash from a long time ago. I still have them. They fit perfectly between the bigger trees in our lineup. And then a couple of gold holographic peel-offs at the edges of that white cardstock is the last little bit of sparkle for this card. This sentiment also kind of influenced my design on this card, from our family to yours. So I guess I should spend some time with the sentiments that are actually in this stamp set, and I could spend more time with that cling stamp too. Our next card is Happy Holidays. Here we have a window card with Santa and those reindeer flying across the moon. You open it up and whoosh, he's gone. And just a sparkle of stars left where Santa once was. I think this is a very fun visual. There's still plenty of room to write a sentiment down here and not get in the moon's way. So I stamped the cling stamp on a panel of the lapis cardstock that I'd done a little blue Hawaii reactive ink blending at the top. I used unicorn white pigment ink, and I tilted this stamp just a little bit to try to get a touch of movement from what's otherwise a very straight up and down image of snow. I die cut the background with a 3 3/4 inch by 5-inch lawn fawn stitched rectangle die, and I centered a 2.5 inch nesting circle die towards the top of the background and die cut the moon. I cut my matte 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches of Hero Hues nautical cardstock, laid my stamped panel on top of that, marked where the moon was, die cut the circle through the matte, and then I glued both of those panels together. So I marked the moon position on the front of a white card base and die cut the circle and then glued the matted panels in place. So they all match up nicely. I stamped Santa using intense black ink and die cut him out along with 2 more white blanks and glued them all together for a good sturdy embellishment. I stamped the sentiment on more lapis cardstock using unicorn white ink, and I embossed that with white embossing powder. And then I die cut it with the matching die. Woohoo! I love the sentiment dies in this kit. Now, I was afraid the sentiment might get a little lost on the lapis background, so I die cut a blank sentiment from Nautilus cardstock and glued it to the back of the sentiment for a touch of a drop shadow. I glued Santa over the moon cutout and glued the sentiment below. Now, it wasn't until I put this together that I thought of adding the swoosh to the inside. It hides behind Santa and his sleigh almost perfectly. I stamped that on the inside with embossing ink, and again, I used that Wow Cloud 9 embossing powder for some nice sparkle in those stars. That's another stamp that you want to avoid over stamping with. Take care not to lose those details, and all those tiny stars read beautifully. Happy Holidays. Whoosh, he's gone. Now, when we were kids, after we put the Christmas tree up, which was usually the weekend after Thanksgiving, and before the presents came out, we would often decorate the bottom of the tree with a little Christmas village. Of course, as the presents started going under the tree, the Christmas village would migrate to the console table. But for a while, we always had a little Christmas village underneath our Christmas tree. I thought the train stamp and the pine branches might replicate that. So now we have our Merry Christmas card underneath the Christmas tree. So the pine branches are stamped on Hero Hues pesto cardstock with Forever Green ink and pine core ink. I die cut both boughs, leaving extra room at the top of the darker layer. I used the wood grain texture fancy die to cut our tree trunk from some brown cardstock in my stash, and I cut that at 1 inch across. Now the tree stand is made from the smallest rounded rectangle infinity die, cut from some brushed silver, and the black legs are cut from a double thick oval frame. I think it looks just like an old tree stand. This is my die cut galore card. The train is stamped and masked in red reactive, pine core, blue reactive, butter bar, and tangerine inks. I stamped the village on a piece of Arctic cardstock using the blue reactive ink and did a partial die cut across the top. I stamped the railroad tracks, the people, and the sentiment with blue reactive ink, and I embossed that sentiment with some clear embossing powder. I took a thin piece of gray cardstock from my stash. I embossed that, dry embossed that with a striped embossing folder and glued that to the front of a white card base. I was a touch worried about thickness with this card, so I pressed the embossed stripes flat. It still reads as nice subtle wallpaper in the back, but there's literally no dimension to that at all. I glued the dark pine branches to the top, then the trunk, then the lighter branches, and assembled the stand on the trunk. I glued the stamp panel flat to the bottom of the card and added the train with a little bit of foam tape. I thought a couple of ornaments dangling from the tree would really drive the point home, so I die cut 2 circles from some metallic cardstock, created a couple of ornament caps, and glued them into the branches of the tree. This is a really fun way to use that pine branches border stamp, and it could be infinitely variable depending on what you want to put underneath your tree. I really enjoyed putting this card together. So I was getting a little Christmased out at this point, a little bit over the holidays. I mean, it is still the middle of October, and I had an idea for a non-holiday card. So for our next card, we've got a happy birthday card using that star swoosh stamp. Now, I used the Gina K Wreath Builder template to stamp this circular blaze of colorful stars. If you notice, there are 16 strips going around the circle. So I did 8 strips to begin with, and then I repositioned the stamp and did 8 more in between all of those. These are stamped with the same inks as the train in this last card, with the addition of grape juice ink for the purples. Once all was stamped, I trimmed the panel to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I glued that to a holographic cardstock mat and those down to a white card base. I found this small sentiment on it's an old freebie stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. I stamped that on a scrap of white cardstock with intense black ink. I embossed that with some clear embossing powder, die cut that out, die cut a larger circle out of that holographic cardstock. I glued those together and then down to the card front. For a final touch of birthday sparkle, I glued down some star sequins down in between all of our star swooshes. I love this image. Almost feels like fireworks going off. There we go, a happy birthday colorful card in our otherwise Christmas set. Okay, that was a nice break from the impending holidays, but I did want to try and colorize that big village stamp. So here we have sending a holiday cheer. Well, this took a little while, but I did manage to get a nice village colored with colored pencils. On a sheet of Stonehenge cardstock, I stamped the village with contour ink a few times, and I colored that all with my Prismacolor colored pencils. I had to keep the points really sharp, and I went very lightly as I added layer after layer of color. Again, this is far from perfect, but it is very colorful rendition of that silhouette stamp. I really love that. I did some light stump blending in the sky and added some white gel pen and some Stardust Sparkle pen for stars in the sky. I trimmed the colored panel down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. I added a thin black mat and glued those to a white card base. I stamped the sentiment on a scrap of white cardstock with blue Hawaii reactive ink, embossed that with clear embossing powder, die cut it out. I also stamped and embossed the star with unicorn white ink and white embossing powder on a scrap of pitch black cardstock and die cut it out as well. I added a couple of die cut blanks behind the sentiment. You can see that's all solid. And I glued that and the star to the card front. I think a lot of the charm of this card comes from the simple fact of the miniature size of that village. There's a lot going on there in less than 1.5 inches of stamping. This is not recommended for for multiples. Sending holiday cheer. Oh, I wouldn't mind living there, although it looks fairly Russian. So the trifold suggestion from the backer card was still in the back of my mind when I created this dimensional scene. And we have 'Tis the Season. Okay, well, there's nothing special there, but look, there's a B over there. There's a B next to a slot there. There's an A there. There's an A there. So I think the A tab goes into the A slot, and the B tab should go into the B slot. And there we have a nice little dimensional kind of trifold. It stands up all on its own. Okay, first, I must mention that I broke down and joined the foiling revolution with the purchase of my own Spellbinders Glimmer machine. I did manage to grab one from Spellbinders itself for $90. It was on sale 3 or 4 weeks ago for $90. I thought that was a great price, so I went ahead and bought one. Now that Hero Arts is getting into the hot foiling craze, I figured I should jump on the bandwagon too. Now, the background snow is foiled on pitch black cardstock using the Twinkle Lights hot foil plate and opaque white foil. I love that white foil that's not shiny, that's opaque. That is hot foiling. I have to play with that machine some more, but so far, so good. I may be hooked. I trimmed the back down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I added a moon die cut from the snow glow paper and the stamped, embossed, and die cut sentiment with some foam tape. Now, I stamped the village and the people and the house and the deer with unicorn white ink on 5 1/2 inch wide pitch black cardstock. And I did more partial die cutting, finished off with some fussy cutting to add some hillsides. I used some micro brushes to add some unicorn white ink to the edges of the hillsides and below the buildings. I also blended in a light touch of sea salt reactive ink on the background behind the village, just a little bit to give it a tiny bit of a glow. On the village piece, I scored a fold line on the left side at 1/4 inch, and on the house piece, I scored a fold line 1/4 inch on the right side. I cut little 1/4 inch wide tabs on the opposite sides of the folded tabs on both pieces, being careful to hide the tab on the village behind the hill on the house. I glued the folded tab of the village piece to the left side of the background, flipped it over, curved it up a little bit, and marked on the background where to cut the slot for the tab. That slot is 5/8 inches from the right side of the background. Then I glued the folded tab on the house panel to the right side of the background, curved that up a little bit more, and marked on the village piece where to cut the slot for the second tab. This slot is actually 3/4 of an inch from the edge of the village panel. I did add an A and a B to the matching slots and tabs with a white gel pen. Unslotted, this card will travel flat in an envelope. And I think the matching A's and B's are enough of a prompt for assembly. And of course, it stands up all on its own. I did add a white panel to the back. Be careful not to glue that slot shut. And that provides a perfect place for your personal message. You could build this on an actual card base, but I thought it was a little more fun just having those curved pieces there to hold the card up. I think the black and white scheme is very striking, and I totally love that curved dimension when it's all assembled. And just like that, we've covered all 10 cards this month. I felt a strong pull towards blue this month, all that snow, but I tried to keep a good amount of color going for those of us unwilling to admit that the holidays are coming. I really enjoyed using all of these different holiday sentiments. There's not a single repeated sentiment anywhere on these cards, and I think this birthday card was a great surprise. I actually used all of the stamps in the stamp set this month, every single one of them. I used most of the dyes, the inks, the papers. There really is no end to the scene-making possibilities with a kit like this. I hope you enjoyed my sometimes wacky take on this classic kit. I think I'm about ready to start working on my own Christmas cards for this year. And this kit is still available at Hero Arts. If you see something you like, or if I've possibly inspired you to create some North Pole vibes of your own, you should grab a kit for yourself before they sell out. If you do go shopping at Hero Arts, please use my links in the description down below. It is always greatly appreciated and helps support this page. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for sharing some time with me today. Let me know which cards are your favorite. Remember to like me, list me, pin me, post me, friend me, follow me, share me with all of your card-making friends. No, seriously, please click the thumbs up at the top of that. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. Don't run with scissors. And as always, I send you and yours love and light and happy crafting. For more detailed information, better pictures, and product links, please visit my website at cardcutups.com.